Close your eyes for a second and think about how much of your life gets written down without you even trying. Your phone knows where you slept last night. Your search bar remembers what you were curious about at 2 a.m. There's probably a satellite photo of your street from last spring sitting in some server farm right now. We are, without question, the most documented generation that has ever existed. Now wind the clock back 500 years, and the paper trail thins out, but it doesn't disappear. We've got letters, portraits, ledgers, maps drawn by hand. 2,000 years back, into the world of Rome, and somehow the record is still rich, aqueducts still standing, coins still turning up in fields, entire libraries of philosophy and law that survive just by being copied often enough. Keep going, 5,000 years into the past, and you hit the first cities, the first written contracts, the first laws carved into clay. That's usually where the story of civilization begins in the textbooks. And that's exactly where it stops making sense. Modern humans, people with the same skull shape, the same brain volume, the same wiring for language and memory and imagination that you're using right now to follow this sentence, have been walking this planet for something like 300,000 years. Maybe longer. Same hardware. Same starting point, biologically, as every person who has ever built a cathedral, written a symphony, or launched a rocket. But everything we call recorded history, every king list, every clay tablet, every pyramid, only stretches back about 5,000 years, maybe 10 if you're generous with the definition. Run the numbers and it gets uncomfortable fast. Somewhere around 97–98% of the entire span of modern human existence has left us almost nothing. No cities we recognize. No writing. Just scattered bones, scattered stones, and an enormous, echoing silence. That's not a small blind spot in the story. That's most of the story. Nearly 300,000 years of fully modern people, doing, what, exactly? And if that thought is keeping you a little too alert right now, don't worry, that's kind of the point of tonight's story, and also exactly why it works so well for drifting off. If you're settling into sleep, go ahead and hit subscribe now so you don't have to reach for your phone later. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is on your clock right now. I love reading those. Somebody in Seoul at 3 a.m., somebody in Sao Paulo just waking up, somebody in Manchester on their lunch break, all of us tangled up in the same story at completely different hours. There's something quietly comforting about that. Okay. Back to the gap. Here's the version most of us grew up with. Early humans were simple hunter-gatherers, clever, sure, but basically wandering bands chipping rocks into points, huddling in caves, scraping by. Then, somewhere around 10 or 12,000 years ago, something flips. Farming shows up. Villages. Writing. Cities. Monuments. The whole toolkit of civilization, arriving almost all at once, like a switch being thrown. It's tidy. It's the kind of story that fits in a textbook chapter. And the deeper archaeologists dig, literally, with trowels in the dirt, and figuratively, with new dating methods and genetic tools, the more that tidy story starts falling apart at the seams. Structures that seem to predate the social organization needed to build them. Star charts and calendar knowledge embedded in sites that are supposedly primitive. Genetic signatures suggesting the entire human species nearly blinked out of existence more than once, for reasons we can only guess at. Population numbers that don't add up cleanly. Tools and techniques that appear in the record fully formed, with no obvious trail of trial and error leading up to them, as if someone handed our ancestors the finished product. It's a little like uncovering a wristwatch in a Bronze Age grave. One is a curiosity. But we keep finding wristwatches, over and over, in places they have no business being, and nobody can fully explain how they got there. And it's not just the physical evidence. Cultures scattered across the globe, Mesopotamia, the Andes, China, Australia's Aboriginal peoples, Scandinavia, cultures that had no plausible contact with each other, tell strangely similar stories. Stories of catastrophic floods. Of wiser ancestors who came before. Of a golden age that ended in disaster, with survivors left to rebuild from almost nothing. Before what, though? Before the flood. Before the sky changed. Before the forgetting. For a long time, historians filed all of this under mythology, imaginative attempts by early people to explain things they didn't understand. But what if a handful of these stories aren't pure invention? What if buried inside centuries of retelling, there are actual fragments of memory, traces of a human story that's stranger and more complicated than the one we've settled on? Tonight, we're going to sit with that gap. We'll walk through the paradox of a species with fully modern brains that somehow took 300,000 years to build its first city. We'll look at a catastrophe that may have nearly wiped humanity off the map entirely. We'll go looking for the coastlines that vanished under rising oceans, the strange stone shapes sitting on the seafloor, the monument that shouldn't exist according to the old timeline, and the technologies that keep showing up centuries, sometimes millennia, earlier than they're supposed to. None of this comes with a clean, satisfying answer. These are slow-burning mysteries, the kind that don't demand sharp focus or quick conclusions. You're allowed to let your mind drift while you listen. Let the questions settle instead of trying to solve them. Whether you're here because you're genuinely curious, or just here for the sound of a calm voice while you fall asleep, either way works. So get comfortable, and let's go looking for the missing centuries. Here's the piece of this puzzle that quietly unsettles a lot of researchers. The brain sitting inside your skull right now, the one doing the work of understanding this sentence, is structurally identical to the brain of someone who lived 300,000 years ago. Same size. Same folds. Same wiring for language, for tool use, for abstract thought. If you could somehow pluck an infant from that world and raise them today, modern hospital, modern school, modern home, nothing about them would set them apart. They'd learn to read. They'd pass algebra. They could become a surgeon, a violinist, an engineer. Their brain would carry exactly the same potential as anyone else's. So here's the question that has no comfortable answer. If humans have had fully modern brains for 300,000 years, why does organized civilization only show up in the last 10,000? What, exactly, were the other 290,000 years for? Researchers sometimes call this the modern human paradox, and it's not really about brain size at all, it's about behavior not matching capability. The archaeological record makes it clear these weren't unsophisticated proto-humans stumbling in the dark. They were us, with all the same cognitive horsepower, just living inside a radically different world. Look at the tools. By roughly 200,000 years ago, early humans across Africa were heat-treating stone to change its internal structure before knapping it, a kind of primitive material science. That's not instinct, that's accumulated knowledge, tested and passed down deliberately. 100,000 years ago, they were building composite tools, hafting sharpened stone points onto wooden shafts using resin adhesives, which meant knowing which trees to tap, how to process the resin, and exactly when in the process to apply it. That's multi-step planning, held in the mind from start to finish. Then there's the art. In a cave on the South African coast, archaeologists uncovered pieces of ochre carved with deliberate, repeating geometric patterns dated to roughly 70,000 years ago, not random scratches, but intentional design. Around the same era, shell beads with drilled holes start appearing, strung as jewelry, evidence of people thinking about appearance, status, belonging, not just survival. By 40,000 years ago, there are elaborate paintings on cave walls in Europe, detailed carvings across Asia, and burial rituals suggesting complex beliefs about death. Music. Storytelling. Almost certainly, fully developed spoken language. So the puzzle isn't intelligence. It's why, despite having all of that, populations stayed small and scattered for so long, technology crept forward at a crawl, and nothing like a city, a written record, or an empire ever took shape, for nearly 300 millennia. Some researchers think it's simply a numbers problem. Tiny, isolated bands can absolutely innovate, but a single group's cleverness often dies with that group. Without a large connected population to preserve and build on new ideas, every generation ends up relearning most of what came before. Progress happens, but it's fragile. One hard winter, one migration, one bad year, and it's gone. Others think something far more violent was steering the story, something that didn't just slow humanity down, but knocked it back to almost nothing, more than once. Roughly 74,000 years ago, a mountain in what's now Indonesia detonated with the force of 1,000 nuclear devices. This wasn't an ordinary eruption, it was a supervolcano, one of the most violent explosive events of the last 2 million years. It hurled so much ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere that it likely triggered a volcanic winter, lasting the better part of a decade. Sunlight dimmed. Temperatures dropped hard. Plant life across huge regions collapsed, and the animals, and people, who depended on those plants faced starvation. Here's where genetics quietly backs up the story. When researchers compare human DNA across every population on Earth, the amount of genetic variation is startlingly low, lower, in fact, than what you'd find among chimpanzees, despite chimps having far smaller total populations. That kind of narrow diversity is the genetic fingerprint of a population that crashed hard, and recently. The timing of the supervolcano lines up almost too well. Some estimates put the surviving human population at only a few thousand individuals scattered across the entire globe, fewer people than live in a single small town today, spread across a planet that had just become nearly unlivable. This wasn't several separate groups in several separate places. This may have been essentially everyone who was left. Sit with that for a second. If it's true, every person alive today descends from that small circle of survivors. Every piece of accumulated knowledge, fire-making, tool design, which plants were safe to eat, existed only in the minds of a few thousand exhausted people trying to stay alive in a world blanketed in ash. How much know-how simply vanished because the person who held it died before passing it on? It's possible that human progress before this point had been building towards something more, expanding trade, improving tools, larger networks, and then the volcano erased most of it, leaving only scattered survivors focused purely on staying alive. But there's a strange silver lining buried in this catastrophe. The people who made it through weren't a random cross-section of humanity, they were, almost by definition, the most adaptable, the most cooperative, the most resourceful. A brutal, compressed round of natural selection, favoring exactly the traits that let a species claw its way back from near extinction. When populations began recovering, their descendants may have carried forward sharper social instincts and stronger collective problem-solving than their pre-eruption ancestors. That might explain why signs of full, behavioral modernity, symbolic art, long-distance trade, complex tool kits, seem to explode into the record around 50 to 60,000 years ago. Not because human minds suddenly changed, but because the post-catastrophe population finally reached a critical mass, enough people, spread widely enough, staying connected enough, that new ideas could spread faster than they were lost. And yet, even with sharper minds and growing numbers, nothing resembling a city or an empire appeared for another 40,000 years. People kept moving with the seasons. Kept making beautiful, sophisticated things. Kept living in small, mobile groups. If the cognitive capacity for civilization was already there, something else was still missing. Now here's a piece of the puzzle that barely gets airtime, and it might be one of the most important. At the peak of the last ice age, so much of Earth's water was locked up in glaciers that global sea level sat roughly 400 feet, about the height of a 40-story building, lower than it does today. Think about where people actually choose to live, throughout every era we do have records for. Not remote mountain plateaus. Coastlines. River mouths. Places where land meets water, because water means fish, shellfish, trade routes, and some of the richest ecosystems on the planet. Today, something like 40% of humanity lives within about 60 miles of a coast. There's no strong reason to think our Ice Age ancestors behaved any differently. Which means, when the glaciers melted and the oceans rose those 400 feet, entire coastal territories, not just beaches, but whole regions extending dozens or hundreds of miles inland from the old shoreline, disappeared beneath the waves. We're not talking about a few lost villages. We're talking about land masses on the scale of nations. Take the land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. For most of human history, Britain wasn't an island at all, it was joined to what's now Denmark and the Netherlands by a huge, fertile expanse of hills, rivers, and wetlands that researchers now call Doggerland. We know it existed because fishing trawlers keep hauling up mammoth bones, worked flint tools, and antler points from the floor of the North Sea. One famous barbed antler point was dragged up from 25 miles off the English coast and dated to roughly 12,000 years ago. That single object came from somewhere inside thousands of square miles of drowned landscape, which raises an obvious question: how many settlements, workshops, or gathering places are still sitting down there, unexplored, simply because underwater excavation is brutally expensive and difficult? And Doggerland is just the one we happen to know about. Across Southeast Asia, the exposed continental shelf once joined islands that are now separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean, forming a landmass researchers call Sundaland, roughly the size of India. Australia's coastline extended far beyond where it sits today, linking up with Tasmania. All of that land was very likely inhabited, at least to the extent that Ice Age populations inhabited anywhere. And nearly all the physical evidence of that habitation has been quietly destroyed, dissolved by currents, buried under sediment, rotted away by time and salt water. Except, every so often, something survives. Off the coast of southern Japan, near Yonaguni Island, a diving guide scouting locations to watch hammerhead sharks in the late 1980s stumbled onto something strange: massive underwater rock formations with flat platforms, sharp right-angle steps, and long straight edges that look disturbingly deliberate. The site spans an area the size of several football fields, rising from a depth of around 80 feet to just a few feet below the surface. A local marine geologist who spent years studying the formation concluded it was man-made, shaped when sea levels were far lower, and later swallowed by the rising ocean, which would place its construction at somewhere around 10,000 years old, possibly older. Mainstream geologists mostly disagree, arguing the straight lines and right angles are simply the natural result of the way this particular sandstone fractures, that our brains are just very good at spotting patterns, even ones that aren't really there. It's a genuinely unresolved argument. Similar half-glimpsed formations have been reported off the coasts of Cuba and India, at depths that, if the formations are truly artificial, would put them well over 10,000 years old. Skeptics point out, fairly, that unusual natural rock formations exist all over the ocean floor, and that a striking-looking shape isn't proof of human hands. But it's also true that we've barely looked. The overwhelming majority of archaeological effort and funding goes toward sites on land, ones we can walk to and dig with a trowel. The ocean floor, especially the shallow shelf areas that were dry land 12,000 years ago, remains almost entirely unmapped at the resolution you'd need to spot something like a submerged settlement. Whatever the truth about any one formation, the larger point stands: enormous stretches of prime, once inhabitable coastline are sitting under water we've barely surveyed, and we genuinely do not know what, if anything, is down there. Around 12,800 years ago, something abrupt and violent seems to have happened to Earth's climate. A long, gradual warming trend suddenly reversed, plunging much of the planet back into near-glacial conditions for roughly 1,000 years, a period researchers call the Younger Dryas. Around the same time, a strange, carbon-rich sediment layer shows up at archaeological sites across multiple continents, containing tiny glass spherules and unusually high concentrations of rare elements, the kind of signature some scientists associate with a cosmic impact or airburst. Large mammal species vanish from the fossil record in massive numbers. Human populations in several regions appear to contract sharply, with evidence of abandoned settlements. What's genuinely eerie is how many unrelated cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, tell a strikingly similar story about this general era. The Mesopotamian flood epic. The Greek tale of a deluge that only two survivors escape. Flood stories in Hindu scripture, in Chinese folklore, across indigenous traditions in North and South America, in Aboriginal Australian storytelling, throughout the Pacific Islands. Mainstream historians have generally treated this as coincidence. Floods happen everywhere, so of course flood myths would appear everywhere too. But look closer at the details, and the overlaps get harder to wave away. Many of these stories describe fire or burning debris falling from the sky just before the flood. Many describe the sun dimming for years afterward, plunging the world into cold and darkness. Nearly all of them describe near-total destruction, followed by a tiny handful of survivors left to rebuild civilization from scratch. If you were a prehistoric person trying to describe, in mythic language, a sky object impact followed by climate collapse, this is roughly the story you'd end up telling. Some researchers, most prominently the writer Graham Hancock, argue this points to a genuinely sophisticated civilization existing before this catastrophe, not necessarily with our level of technology, but with real command of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy, wiped out almost entirely, its survivors scattering with only fragments of their knowledge intact. Mainstream archaeology pushes back hard on this, pointing out there's no direct evidence, no cities, no writing systems, nothing but hunter-gatherer toolkits from that period. But the uncomfortable follow-up question is this: if such a civilization existed mainly along coastlines that are now hundreds of feet underwater, how much physical evidence would we actually expect to find? We've barely scratched the surface, sometimes literally, of the ocean floor that used to be dry land. The debate between the catastrophist camp and mainstream archaeology gets heated, occasionally bitter, and it isn't close to settled. What's not really in dispute is that something dramatic happened to the climate and to human populations around this time. Whether it involved a lost advanced civilization is far more speculative, but the idea that our past might be more violent and more complicated than the tidy textbook version isn't something you can dismiss out of hand either. For decades, the standard model was simple: monumental architecture requires agriculture, because you need surplus food and settled populations before anyone has the spare time or organization to build something enormous. Farming comes first, monuments come after. Then, in the mid-1990s, archaeologists in southeastern Turkey uncovered a site called Göbekli Tepe. What they found were massive carved limestone pillars, some over 15 feet tall and weighing many tons, arranged in circular enclosures and decorated with detailed carvings of animals, foxes, scorpions, vultures, boars. Radiocarbon dating placed the site at roughly 11,500 years old, which put its construction before the earliest confirmed evidence of farming in the region, built not by settled farmers but, as far as anyone can tell, by hunter-gatherers. This shouldn't have been possible under the old model. Moving and carving stones of that size requires organizing dozens, maybe hundreds, of people over an extended period, the kind of large-scale cooperative labor supposedly reserved for agricultural societies with food surpluses and social hierarchies. And yet here it was, built by people who, according to the textbook, weren't supposed to have that level of organization at all. Some researchers now flip the old sequence entirely, suggesting that the social coordination required to build sites like this one might have come first, and that farming developed afterward, partly to support the populations gathering at these sites. Either way, Göbekli Tepe forced a genuine rewrite of the timeline, a reminder that hunter-gatherer doesn't automatically mean incapable of monumental achievement. If one site this old and this sophisticated could sit buried and unknown until the 1990s, it raises an obvious question: what else is still out there, unexcavated? Here's a humbling number: archaeologists estimate that something like 1%, possibly far less, of the world's potential archaeological sites have ever been properly excavated. We are reconstructing the entire span of human prehistory from a sliver of the available evidence, because digging is slow, expensive, and requires permits, funding, and access that most regions simply don't have. Enormous stretches of Africa, South America, and Asia have barely been surveyed at all, not from lack of interest, but from lack of resources. And even where we do dig, most of what people actually made and used doesn't survive to be found. Wood rots. Textiles disintegrate within a few thousand years at best. Leather, basketry, plant-based medicine, cordage, all of it vanishes, usually within a few centuries, unless conditions are freakishly favorable. Think about how sophisticated wooden architecture can be: Japanese temple carpentry, Scandinavian stave churches, elaborate longhouses, built with real skill and engineering, using no stone at all. A society could have built extraordinary things out of wood and textile 50,000 years ago, and we would have zero record of it today. They'd look, in the archaeological record, like simple foragers, not because that's what they were, but because everything that would prove otherwise rotted away millennia ago. We're left trying to understand a painting by studying only the frame. Layer onto that the instability of ancient climate itself. Ice core samples from Greenland show temperature swings of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius occurring within a single decade during the last ice age, not gradual drift, but abrupt lurches. Ocean currents collapsing within one human lifetime. Monsoon patterns shifting within a few generations. Any society, however sophisticated, built around a particular climate could be devastated almost overnight when that climate suddenly changed, its territory rendered uninhabitable, its food sources gone, its technologies useless. And this didn't happen once. It likely happened again and again throughout the exact stretch of time we're trying to understand, each time potentially wiping out whatever progress had been made in scattering the survivors to start over. Every so often, a single discovery forces the entire field to rewrite what it thought it knew, and it's happened repeatedly in just the last couple of decades. In 2010, a single finger bone found in a Siberian cave revealed an entirely unknown human lineage, now known as the Denisovans, who interbred with modern humans and left genetic traces still present in populations across Asia and the Pacific today. In 2013, bones found deep in a South African cave system revealed another previously unknown species, one with a brain roughly a third the size of ours, yet showing possible evidence of deliberate burial behavior, a discovery still forcing researchers to reconsider what primitive actually means. And then there's the technology that's currently rewriting the map, literally. LiDAR, a laser-based scanning system carried by aircraft, can now see straight through dense forest canopy to map the ground beneath it in extraordinary detail. In Central America, LiDAR surveys have revealed entire Maya cities, road networks, and agricultural systems hidden beneath jungle that archaeologists had walked across for 100 years without realizing what was underneath their boots. In Cambodia, the same technology revealed that Angkor Wat wasn't an isolated temple complex at all, but the center of a sprawling urban landscape covering hundreds of square miles, an entire medieval city nobody knew was there. Most of the planet still hasn't been surveyed this way. Every few months brings another discovery that was completely invisible until someone finally looked with the right tool. So here's where the evidence actually leaves us. Fully modern humans, same brains, same potential, same everything you're using right now, existed for somewhere close to 300,000 years before anything resembling a city appeared. That's not a small oversight in the timeline. That's a span longer than the entirety of recorded history, repeated roughly 60 times over. For most of that vast stretch, these people, our direct ancestors, left behind almost nothing but stone tools and scattered bones. No permanent settlements. No writing. Just small, mobile groups surviving in landscapes we can barely picture, in ways we're still working to understand. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, around 12,000 years ago, everything shifts: farming, settlements, monumental architecture, complex societies, as if humanity flipped a switch all at once. But we've spent tonight poking holes in that clean story. A monument at Göbekli Tepe, apparently built by people who supposedly lacked the social structure to build it. Strange formations sitting on drowned coastlines around the world, hinting at settlements that vanished under rising seas. Flood stories echoing across cultures that had no contact with one another. Technologies that appear in the record with no visible trail of trial and error leading up to them. Genetic evidence of a population crash that nearly ended the human story before it properly began. Every one of these threads chips away at what we thought we knew, and pushes the timeline of human sophistication a little further back. And here's the honest, humbling truth: we may never get the full picture. The evidence is too scattered, too fragile, too thoroughly erased by ice, ocean, and time, and most of what people actually built simply doesn't survive long enough to be found. If our own civilization vanished tomorrow, what would still be recognizable in 100,000 years, after ice ages and rising seas and shifting continents? A handful of stone foundations, maybe. Some fired pottery. Traces of radioactive residue in the sediment. Everything else, every book, every screen, every building, gone. Future researchers, digging through what's left, might reasonably conclude we were barely different from the people who came before us. So when we look back at those long, blank stretches of our own past, the real question isn't whether we're missing something. It's how much. How many small societies rose, thrived for generations in ways we'd call civilized, and vanished without leaving a trace we know how to recognize. Trying to reconstruct human prehistory is a little like trying to read a 1,000-page book with 990 pages torn out, and the few remaining ones warped by water damage, written in a script you barely know. You can make educated guesses. You can fill in a few of the blanks. But you're never going to read the whole story. And yet the search keeps going. New underwater surveys keep turning up structures beneath ancient shorelines. New genetic studies keep revealing population movements nobody expected. New dating techniques keep pushing site ages further back than anyone assumed. Just in the last few years, evidence of deliberate fire use dating back nearly 2 million years has surfaced. Tools found in the Americas may predate the migrations we thought started everything by tens of thousands of years. Every discovery cracks the door open a little wider. The story of human prehistory isn't finished. There are chapters still sitting under jungle canopy, beneath desert sand, under ocean swells, inside caves nobody has entered yet, fragments of a puzzle scattered across every continent, waiting for someone to notice how they fit together. Maybe that's the part of this mystery worth sitting with as you drift off tonight. It isn't closed. It isn't resolved. It's still unfolding, one excavation, one scan, one stubborn question at a time. Before you go, I'd love to know, which part of tonight's story stuck with you the most? Are you listening from somewhere an ancient culture once called home? Drop it in the comments, and if this kept you company tonight, go ahead and subscribe. There are plenty more forgotten chapters of our past still waiting to be told. Because in the end, every one of us is connected to those distant ancestors who somehow made it through disasters we can barely imagine and kept the thread of humanity going. Their story is still our story. And somewhere in those long, silent centuries we can't quite explain, there might be a better answer to who we really are, and what we're still capable of becoming. Sleep well.